Welcome, GM, everybody. GM. Great to see everybody. We're gonna get going on time today while people trickle in, just so we can use every moment that we have here today with Yancey Strickler, who we're very excited to have as a guest. We'll do about 5 minutes of introduction, Yancey, before we introduce you. So the way that we like to start Kernel Firesides first is with a bit of context on the room that you're entering. So Kernel Block 4, as we mentioned before kicking off here, the way that we like to describe Kernel is an internet garden tended to by brilliant people who are in or into Web3. And I am, so grateful for each of the people who's with us today. Everyone who's one of these Zoom participants is working on something incredible or is simply incredible on their own. And the way we think about Kernel is listed at the bottom there, this underground stream feeding Web3 projects, a place of honesty, excellence, clarity, and heightened awareness, a place to practice and to serve. And we had a junta yesterday about information age institutions, and it reminded me that the first thing that we explore practicing is gratitude. And I think that today we have lots to be grateful for as we explore, I think, one of the turning point topics in the syllabus, where we go from looking backwards at a lot of the trends that have made up the last 5 years of cryptocurrency and the overall Web3 movement to looking forward and asking what type of culture and customs we want to create together. So you've seen this before, but just to put it out there once more, it's an incredible group that we have here today. We'll make sure to save some time at the end for questions so you can hear from them directly. And I think you'll get a sense that behind the affiliations, it's just a wonderful group. So KB4, thank you for being you. We're halfway through the program, which has the Learn track component that we'll be focusing on today, but also a more build-oriented track. We've almost finished with Kernel Expo Week, which has completed with about 50 projects sharing their journeys. We had an NFT and Metaverse Day on Tuesday, a DAO and Infrastructure Day yesterday, and then tomorrow is our last day on DeFi and regenerative finance, which are two fun things to think about together. So to everyone who already presented, it truly was an incredible experience. For me, yesterday, specifically the DAO and Infrastructure Day, you saw about 60 people there, about 20 rooms where people were sharing kind of science fair style what they were up to, and each of the rooms was just full of energy, and it meant a lot to be there. Expo Week marks a turning point on the build track where things do slow down a bit. We have weeks 5, 6, and 7 where if you are going down a path where you think that, hey, the projects that I'm working on, I might want to go down different avenues of fundraising, which don't resemble necessarily the Web2 means, although Kickstarter is a good example of some of the styles that Web3 has picked up upon in allowing for more interesting avenues for fundraising. There are many that are non-traditional. So we'll explore some of those for the projects that are interested, but generally it will be slower. It will be time to kind of decompress from what's been a bit of a hectic first month introduction and to slow into deeper conversations with smaller groups of people. So that's where we are. And without further ado, I'll pass the mic to Andy to talk us through where we are in the syllabus, information age institutions.
Thank you so much. I think you've done a wonderful job already, and I don't want to take too much of our time today. All I will say is that each week it should become more and more apparent that so much of our focus is placed on self-knowledge as one of the primary technologies that we can move back into and applying to our work in the world. So if you were with us in the discussions yesterday, we spent a large part of the time talking about the kinds of customs and institutions that will allow for us to reconnect with one another and reconnect in sort of these joyfully subversive ways that allow us to breathe together, to conspire in constructive, creative, and collaborative ways that are premised on this new kind of econo-linguistic network in which we can operate that allows for more trust in really interesting dimensions. The thing that I wanted to kind of just point attention to today as we move into a conversation with Yancey is that there are two other aspects of this week's module which are also worth considering. One of my favorite essays that was written in the sort of last 10 or 11 years in which crypto has really been a thing came from Vinay Gupta and is this question of identity. Who are you? Wonderful question. And I really think that it's worth exploring in depth the impacts of this question in your own lives as you go through the rest of the week and indeed the rest of the syllabus. There is a wonderful koan which it begins with, which comes from one of my favorite Zen teachers, a man named Ikkyu, who is also known as Crazy Cloud. And it reads, "No masters, only you. The master is you. Wonderful, no? Or only one koan matters, you." I think that when we begin to really unearth this kind of stuff and look with honesty and courage and humility into the nature of our intention and our desire to produce anything in this world, we can come to a much clearer sense of both where we stand and what it might look like to imagine delightful future possibilities, which I think is going to form a large part of the conversation today. So while there are many other things to say about the syllabus, and as always, this underlying theme of the garden and of cultivating the kinds of space both within yourself and in your environments which allow for genuinely creative and considerate approaches to any action or intention, this particular feature of self-inquiry, of looking into the nature of your awareness, of beginning simply with being, and then moving into what it means for that being to be entangled with the world in response-able and scale-able ways is very interesting. So I will let Vivek introduce our incredible guest, and then, as per usual, pepper him with questions.
Yes. For those of you who don't know Yancey, please help us give a warm welcome to Yancey Strickler. In his, I think, there's so many words to describe the way that Yancey has moved through the world, but the most obvious place to start is with Kickstarter. He co-founded Kickstarter and was a big part of scaling Kickstarter to what it is today, which in many ways is a huge inspiration for all of the alternative fundraising paths that are now available in Web3. As he thought about alternative paths, he then wrote a book called "This Could Be Our Future," a manifesto for a more generous world, which thought about how we could imagine a world that was driven with a variety of motives and value systems built in, as opposed to perhaps a smaller number, which led him to co-creating the Bento Society, which is self-described as a welcoming space for people to rejuvenate themselves and co-imagine the world together. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Yancey.
What's up? What's up, y'all? Nice to meet you today.
Yancey, thank you so much for joining us. It's really a delight and an honor to have you. Vivek has kindly, shown us the title of your book, which is really wonderful. This idea of, a manifesto for a more generous world has captured many people's imagination. And in the book, you sort of say that Western society is trapped by these three assumptions: that the point of life is to maximize your self-interest and wealth, that we're all individuals trapped in an adversarial world, and that this situation is kind of natural and inevitable. And when those three ideas are the foundation of society, it's the very thing which keeps us separate, keeps us powerless, and limits our imagination for the future. So I wonder if we can begin by just speaking very simply about what you understand the word generosity to mean, particularly in this context of imagination and collective imagination.
Yeah. I was when I started this project, I wasn't sure where it would end up. But the experience of Kickstarter was really instructive in that for the three of us who founded it, we were all artists and creative people. My partner Perry was a conceptual artist. I was a music critic and I had a record label. Our other founder was Charles Adler, was a designer. And so we did not identify as business people and felt kind of alienated by the business world. And a lot of the path we carved in Kickstarter was just sort of staying true to our creative roots and kind of struggling to exist in this world that we had found ourselves in. And in trying to unpack that experience, I was trying to understand like what was it that made us distinct? And it was really that we had this wider view of value. We saw financial outcomes as just one piece of a puzzle. And we actually, in becoming a public benefit corporation, like legally inscribed that other values would be just as important as financial value. But so the project started by just like trying to understand our own experience, trying to understand what is the history of how we thought about value. And where I arrived at what I mean by generous, I think generous is about seeing a wider definition of self. I think the 20th century created a highly individualized notion of self. And this happened through marketing campaigns, the creation of PR. This happened through mass media, where we were spoken to as if we were individuals by the television, which was, all a facade, but it served to really isolate people. And there's a lot of things that came out of that. But what I really feel is that it's trapped us in a very limited notion of self. And a breakthrough I had while writing the book was creating this idea of the bento, which is a simple 2x2 graph, but that it illustrates that your true self-interest is now me, what you as an individual want and need right now, which is how the world thinks of self-interest today. But there's also future me, the person you are hoping to become. That person becomes real or not based on the decisions we make at any given moment. There's also now us, the core people in our life who we care about. Our decisions affect them and they affect us. And then future us, because we leave a footprint in the future. And of course, we actively care about the world our future generations will live in. And so this expansion of self from just this one isolated now me, I only have to go get mine, only what's happening the next 24 hours matters, and try to extend what is rational and what we can have collective conversations about to, say, a collective self-interest, to a future self-interest, to your future self. To me, that is what unlocks generosity, because it just changes the rational context of your choices. I mean, in the book, I talk about how like a smoker trying to decide whether or not they quit smoking, if they ask each of these voices of self-interest what they think, like the voice thinking about their family says quit smoking, the voice thinking about their kids says quit smoking, the voice thinking about their future self says quit smoking, but the voice that thinks about what they want right now says, hell no, don't quit. Like, we love nicotine, don't put us through this. And each of these voices is speaking truthfully. But in a world where we only know how to listen to that now me, we get trapped in these very short-term perspectives. So I'm a great optimist about people. And I think that if we can see the whole picture, we'll act on the whole picture. And to me, what is generous is expanding the notion of self. And once you expand that notion of self, the notion of value also changes, because financial value, that rules the house of now me, right? You need those basic necessities to survive. But what values rule our relationships? Fairness, loyalty, compassion, care. What values rule our future self? Commitment, purpose, mastery. There are other kinds of values that come into play that you then have to start thinking about as you begin to really, be conscious of your choices. So it's really just about how can we see a better version of reality, a more accurate version as what reflects our lived lives. And what that really unlocks is that there's a huge space of collective value and collective self-interest that we don't tend to very well. And this has been a lot of the challenge of capitalism. There's a lot of hyper focus on self, on your own earnings, but what is that larger impact? And I think that is where, I think Web3 is trying to speak to. Certainly, there have been a lot of nice attempts throughout the web, but to me, it's an expansion of self that is the key.
I have two questions. I'll go with the shorter one first, which is that this expansion of self and the awareness of wider collective kinds of value, not just value narrowly defined, but many different kinds of value. It speaks to a wonderful imaginative possibility of what we really means, that word. So in the context of this expanded series of self, how do you define we, and how do you think about that in the context of Bento and your own work?
Yeah, I love that question, because when I first designed the Bento and I imagined this us space, I immediately jumped to like the global we, like we're all in this, it's one planet, so, but as I started, the Bento is a practical tool for making decisions. And as I started using that, and you're asking yourself, okay, how should I do this for the benefit of all humankind? Very quickly, you're like, that is not a reasonable cross for me to bear. And there's a lot of people in humankind I don't like, and maybe I don't want to make decisions for them. And like, that is maybe just an unrealistic expectation. So I see we as being people that you emotionally care about or feel responsible for. And some people have a bigger we than others. And I think in some ways that might be an unsatisfying answer, like we should be caring for all forms of life. I mean, it's hard to argue against that, but I just don't think that's a reasonable expectation. And so in a world where our we is just an awareness of really of the people with whom we have core relationships, and we are increasing our listening, increasing our ability to anticipate their needs, or to do things for those people, I think that on its own is a massive step change in the improvement of the world. And so we don't need to get to global humanist values exactly, but I think just asking people, teaching people to do their daily lives a bit better, I think that has big gains. So yeah, I started with universalism, and then I found that even I failed the universalist tests. So it's like, let's just all do the best with the people we care about. And I think that helps a lot.
Incredible. One of the things which really attracted me, in fact, to the book, and also just to exploring more of your work, was when I went and looked at some of the reviews on Goodreads and these other places where you can find such things. Some of them had commented on, oh, this is a wonderful vision, and I feel so deeply that the author has understood the problems of the world, but it's just so simple. And I was like, amazing, this is incredible. I love that kind of thing, because I'm the sort of person who really thinks that in simplicity is the real possibility and hope, and imagination. There's room for me to exercise my own imagination.
Yeah.
And in some of your conversations with other well-known figures in the world, particularly Mariano Mazzucato, this wonderful economist, she speaks a lot about the necessity of having theory and practice integrated. And it seems to me that simple frameworks, which don't set out to specify exactly how the entire economy of the future is exactly going to look with A, B, C, and D based on Marx and taking from Hayek and von Mises, that in fact the approach which you have taken to have some kind of framework in which people can do their own imagination is a really, really interesting it's a really interesting approach. And I wonder if that's something which has sort of been with you consciously, or if it just emerged out of this, sort of backstory which you've hinted at in discussing Kickstarter and not being in business.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, one is that it is a very simple tool where, the end result I came to is 4 boxes. But, I spent, I had this lived experience of being in boardrooms, trying to make decisions for the right reasons, even in a room of all good people, sometimes struggling to do that because we don't have the language to justify it. Because there's a financial outcome over here, and there's all this like mix of feelings over here that are harder to pin down, and you're like arguing in these 2 languages that have nothing to say to each other. And just feeling like that is a that's a challenging situation. Like, how do we get through that? And so I spent a lot of time reading just the history of money, history of money and history of value, reading David Graeber, reading Adam Smith, reading Rawls, reading the books I was supposed to read in college. And there was like a massive unlock for me came when I read this book called Spheres of Justice by this guy, Michael Walzer. And he's a Princeton professor, still alive, like in his 90s. And in this book, he argues that value is like value is always localized. Value is always true to the eye of the beholder. And all forms of injustice are one person imposing their value system on someone else unjustly. And the goal that we should look for is not a world where everyone is equal, but we should work towards a world where every value system is given the right to operate in its own domain, and there isn't anything imposing it. So there's like example of an imposing value system would be the Catholic Church trying to get Galileo to refute, the heliocentric view. Like, that is science using or the church unjustly using its power to overrule the values of science. Or money often does this, the values of money overrule things. But so this notion that like every value has its rightful domain, I thought was really fascinating. And then I spent like 6 months trying to read anything that had referenced this book, because it's not a very well-known book. And I ended up coming across one by a philosopher and economist named Elizabeth Anderson. She's the chair of philosophy at the University of Michigan and has become a bigger figure in the past few years. But she wrote a great book called Value and Ethics in Economics. And it's basically a sequel to this Michael Walzer book. And she talks about how everyone has a lens for value, and that everyone has a different notions of value, and that different people will rationally respond to the same situation with different desires, different outcomes based on their lived experience. And that before making any decision, the first step we should do is to try on different lenses to find what value is most at stake. This is like the takeaway from her book. Amazing book. And I felt like, after reading those two, I felt like the Bento to me was like this pop sellout sequel, where it's like trying to take those ideas of how do you find the right lens for value? How do you know how to sort out a situation? How do you know what's at stake? And try to turn it into like an interface. I think of the Bento as an interface, but it's trying to apply that same concept of there are values that have more or less sway in certain dimensions of our life. And how is it that we can consistently see those things and make decisions that honor them? And so, yeah, so that's been this long process, but it's been interesting to to turn that into something that you actively use, to turn that into a tool, to make that lens something you can constantly return to. And to me, it's like, the challenge I find in being in just like the intellectual exploration world and people who are just writing on economic matters, things like that, is how are you helping someone change a decision? How is an outcome changing for a person through these macro things that change? But to me, I think people have good instincts about what's right and wrong for them, but there's sometimes we have confusing messages and we need help sorting them out, and there are different values at stake and knowing which thing is most important. And so it's trying to get closer to some way to help us suss that out, because we're talking about things that are hard to define, hard to pin down, but yet our bodies can feel when we're on the right path and on the wrong path. So yeah, to me, I think you have to boil this down to something simple to have any value to people, and for it to be an actual tool, because I think that's where behavior changes. I more and more I am less interested in the academic explorations and more what is the application? How do we manifest that? How do we conjugate something into a product or into something that someone can feel? Because I think that's how people's life experiences change.
It's really incredible. One of the arguments, I think perhaps in other discussions, we might ask you to define value at this point, but we've already kind of covered that in our syllabus. And one of the points that we put forward is that it's trust in clearly shared truths. And when we take this local lens and look at the people that we care about, all of these beautiful things that you've been speaking about, it adds more shade and color to that particular idea. And what I actually want to pick up on is this notion of the bento as a tool or an interface, because in the book itself, you know, you have this really interesting part where you speak about, yes, the background of game theory, which we have covered also in Kernel in terms of majority games of Vitalik and Nikki Case's wonderful game of the evolution of trust and cooperation. But you're speaking there about the language of the game itself. And a lot of Kernel, we've been talking also about, you know, the development of these kinds of econo-linguistic tools where the execution of language happens in a public, adversarial, global environment that is deterministic and accessible by all, is a development of the order of language, not a new kind of language. It's of the order of language. And as you say, it's very difficult to talk about that kind of thing in natural language. And there's something really critical for me about this notion of the bento is not a theory. It's an interface. It's a tool, because that begins to like pick at this notion of like a transformative tool for thoughts, a custom or some kind of practice which has beneath it the theory imbued by many generations of thinkers, and yet is not about conceptual analysis only. It might begin there, but it's about breathing, and it's about imagination, and it's about a kind of collective exploration. You have bento groups that you run, which are also these kind of scripted journeys that people go through in seasons. It's totally fascinating. So I wonder, can you pick a little bit more at this transformative tool for thinking rather than just theorizing, and how that applies to the languages with which we might relate in a more generous future?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I just had this flash of like the second day I made the bento, I was like just trying to use it. I immediately thought of it as a tool and I was trying to use it. And I discovered that like, oh, wow, if someone is like a white nationalist or a jihadist or some horrible person and they use the bento, this isn't going to like fix them. And I was really worried. I'm like, oh, this might actually make them a more effective jihadist, you know, like they get closer to their nature. But I came to think that was a good thing, because that meant I wasn't imposing any values whatsoever. I was just exposing someone to their values. And so if I'm not imposing a value system other than awareness, I think that's powerful. The tool thing, yeah, I mean, some of that is like my own neuroses of like, I don't know why, but all my life I've had a recurring question of like, are you real? Like, sure, you have good ideas. You could be whatever, charming sometimes, but are you real? Are you like following through? And it like drives me to follow through sometimes to ridiculous ends, to like execute an idea as far as I can to prove this to myself. So a little bit of like, can I make this into a tool? Can I make this into a season of experiences? Can I make this into a community of people? It's a little bit like, yeah, I'm speaking to my own insecurities of wanting my ideas to have actual value to people and not just be, you know, mental masturbation or something. But, you know, I think that there is I'm doing this right now with an idea. So I have a new startup that'll be launching soon. And it started as an idea and as a thing I wrote, but like writing it didn't feel like it explored the idea fully enough. And so like turning something into a tool to me is a way of, I don't know, of allowing it to be free. Of one of the great benefits I've gotten from bento is like learning how other people think. And so seeing how other people operate with your tool is fascinating. You learn so much. I mean, I remember that with Kickstarter, like the first time someone had a project where they like were really expressive using the medium in a way that we hadn't anticipated was like the day the platform became alive. So there's I think I've just learned through past experiences that there's a power if you can create a form that allows other people to explore themselves, and that, you know, those are like just the best moments, the best kind of outcomes. So I'm very driven to that, and I find just the ideating to be fun, but ultimately unsatisfying and not enough. And even I was reflecting before we began, like the first half of this year, I was really just hanging out with the idea people and trying, connecting with various people who I read and admire, and I don't know, trying to create some momentum around these ideas. But in the end, I've been far more satisfied with like the second half of the year, where I've been more focused on how do I build tools to try to like bring these things into the world, and let's create a new value systems in Web3 rather than just like being in Twitter arguments about, shit that's probably not going to change based on this Twitter argument. And so I think that there's a gravity to real that I'm constantly wrestling with, and that provokes, building more directly applicable things.
I wonder, Yancey, just thinking about your startup, I'm sure everyone's really excited now and wondering what it is and what more you can share about it. But I wonder what that experience has been like for you, because when I discovered the Bento Society just a few months ago, when I was coming into Web3, I thought, wow, this feels like Web3 before Web3. So I wonder, in terms of kind of this lens that you have, and I think have had for some time, and then seeing kind of the growth of this Web3 community and kind of more intentionally having a startup in this space, what has that journey been like for you?
Yeah, it was, I've been following crypto, forever, and have played around with it. But honestly, it was Scott and Kevin from Gitcoin started tweeting about the Bento. And that happened shortly after the book came out, and Herod, calling it out as like, hey, here we're talking about collective value. We're talking about all these things. Like, here's a model for that. And I hadn't seen that, like that intellectual crossover before. And I think seeing them pick it up and talk about it, and talking to them, just made me see, so this is a place where we're trying to build build things for this space, right? We're trying to hard code those spaces into our tools and our systems. And that, brought a lot of energy and excitement to me of like, yeah, awesome. And just, made me want to be helpful and participate. And so I'm, happy to work with Gitcoin and other internet and places like that on various projects that, we all care about. For me, my current project, it began with the beginning of the year, earlier the year, where I was managing a lot of different projects. I wrote another book this past year. I have another one in progress. I have Bento Society. I have had a podcast, a newsletter, all this shit, too much shit. And I was feeling frustrated myself, like, what the hell am I doing? I have so much stuff going on. Like, what a failure I am. If only I could, whatever, be like somebody else. And I felt overwhelmed by my ideas. And at like the depth of being frustrated with myself, which is always a good place for me, I had this flash of, well, what if I'm a label, like a record label? Because a record label, if you're like a punk record label, you put out punk records or something, but like you do a lot of different things. You put out records by different bands. There's like tours, there's videos, or different mediums and things you do. It's not like you're just doing the same thing every day. And when I looked at all my projects as like a label, suddenly I could see like there are these things where I was collaborating with other people, or I'd almost signed people and was putting out work by others, or maybe I released something, but I didn't have to keep doing it anymore. I'd already like dropped that. And so that could be done if I was a label. I didn't have to think about continuing to support it. And also when I looked across all of my work, I could see that even though there were like lots of different forms and mediums and language, like they were all essentially communicating the same thing. And so this was like a really powerful insight, because suddenly like all of my disparateness felt more like a feature than a bug, and something I could lean into. And this way of seeing myself as this entity just opened up a lot of avenues for me. And so I started sharing that idea with other artist friends, and kept getting similar like feelings of unlock from other people. Like, oh, this is quite helpful. Like this is almost like this is a nice pair of glasses to try on and like look at my work and see what happens. And so I like wrote a long piece. I did a lot of thinking about this, and what I came to see was that, you know, there's a concept of a record label, there's fashion labels, but there's also like an art gallery, a movie studio, a book publisher. I think even DAOs and social clubs are all part of a category that I call culture labels, which are entities that exist to promote some cultural idea in some form or another. That could be a certain aesthetic, that could be some belief, you could be an activist. It could just be like, we put out comedy movies, you know, and that's the culture we're promoting. But each of these labels is a startup. They are startups for culture. They are groups of people banding together under a common identity to promote a worldview through discrete releases, right? You do a drop, then another drop, but all these are like speaking to some idea. And I think that the label as a form has a bad brand, because of major labels, has a bad brand because of being independent is so evocative and cool. But labels are how you create economic security. Labels are how you have startup capital. And I believe that the label is a form that can be reinvigorated as a means of collective creation. And so the product that I'm launching in January with a group of friends is called Meta Label, and it is a platform for labels. And there is, I also believe there's a new type of label. What my own work is I am a meta label, and a meta label is a new type of label that's internet aware, that is not selling a product with their releases, but is pushing an idea, right? They're trying to they're trying to stand for something in culture. They're trying to make people see a certain way. And they're doing discrete projects over time, collaborating with other people to try to establish that worldview in the public consciousness. And so I think this form of being a label is the next wave, and that being a creator is awesome, but being a label is the next level up, because you're extending economic security and opportunity to others. You're not just keeping it for yourself. So the new project is, building a platform called Meta Label and really making the case that this is really how we should evolve. This is what collective collaboration looks like online. And this is a form that represents it's kind of a recipe for culture creation. And so for me, that started with like, oh, this is a cool idea. I made my own website, of myself as a label, but felt like, I think there's more to this. And that has now evolved into building a platform for others to like use this lens to share their work. And, my hope is to advocate for labels as startups for culture. And like, this is a crucial new form that we should be embracing. And DAOs and people hanging out in Discords together, great, have a purpose, have a shared purpose, like standing for something, pushing for something in the wider world. And again, the label is a frame you can use to do that.
It's funny, just as you're talking about this idea of meta labels, and I really, really love this idea of discrete projects. I think that it creates so much space and freedom in terms of what is possible. I think even just the difference between an artist and a label is, when an artist releases something that you're not used to, that is different to the previous 3 albums, is outrage, but a label has so much more flexibility and freedom. But I was just thinking that kind of period, that few months where you were looking into kind of more of the academic or kind of intellectual space, and just thinking about if those individuals saw themselves with that label, what that might mean, because they might be some of the best at kind of committing decades to one niche. And so I'm really excited just kind of with your, because you spoke about Gitcoin and you have lots of context for that, this idea of public goods as like a value and the product being values. I wonder how you think about that in terms of where we started with this like very individualized sense of self-interest over the 20th century, and then how this idea of a meta label might move us into a different space where, organizations like Gitcoin are creating cultural ideas like public goods as their product.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think Gitcoin is absolutely an example of a meta label, of a culture label. I mean, I think that, I lost my train of thought while shouting out Gitcoin. Oh no, I don't remember where I was going to go with that. I had something good for you. Oh yes. So the internet until now has been like almost solely single player mode, right? Like websites only recognize us as individuals. Everything is individualized. There are networks that allow us to connect, but still those are individual actions. To me, like the promise of, it's what DAOs are, the promise of labels is internet in group mode. And if by being a part of an entity, if I get certain rights that follow me around, or, if we can act in concert, act together, I think that the product experiences we have online will greatly inform our senses of self, right? That's already happens with like our feelings of self-worth and Instagram. And so, so if we can expand like the default modes of the internet from being solely individualized to also these group nodes, which I think is what DAOs are doing, I think that just changes our perceptions. It changes how people think about themselves. It changes your calculus when making decisions. And so I think that is like maybe one of the, the foundational unlocks of Web3 will be that, this more like sort of group mode experience of online life.
One of the little known facts about Yancey Strickler is that he spent a fair bit of time as a niche music DJ, doing all sorts of interesting things in New York, right? I think that was where you were based. And, in speaking about this kind of stuff, it's really interesting to me in your own bento box when you were giving the demonstration of how this particular interface might be used. In the future me box, you placed these words to have a moral perspective and to be in harmony with the world around me. Yeah. And you also speak about creating opportunities for coherence, acting in concert, all of these wonderful, beautiful musical metaphors. I wonder what it means to you to really be in harmony with the world around you and to create coherence. Is it this kind of thing? And can you expand a little bit more on that?
Yeah, totally. Well, it's a practice. It's a discipline. It begins with acknowledging that these spaces are real and that they matter. I had to make the bento because I wasn't doing a great job of living up to who I wanted to be, right? Like I was more me oriented than us oriented. And I was so focused on projects and work that like time spent with friends or family felt like it's like waiting in an airport till I could get back to work. I had too much of that attitude. The only value I saw was in, these certain dimensions of life. And so I needed that bento to teach me, to remind me it's a tool that like balances my own weakness as a human being. And what that means on a practical basis is that every single week, I make a to-do list using the bento. I have a weekly bento and I draw the 4 boxes of the bento and I fill in my to-do list going box by box. So my now me is always like work shit I have to do, errands, things like that. My now us, I write down who are the key people in my life I want to spend time with this week? Who have I not spoken to in a while that I want to? My future me, I like sort of meditate and try to tap into that older, wiser version of me and like listen to what they have to say, which is inevitably like, calm down, it's going to be okay. Stop worrying, just chill already. And then future us, I ask myself every week, I have to think, what am I practically doing in the next 7 days that contributes to the future I want for my kid? And that forces me to do things like I got to learn about something. I got to teach someone about something. I need to give my time in some way. And so what this bento represents is like a very practical reflection of the sort of multidimensional sense of myself and of what's important. Now, the challenge is that in any given day, Twitter and my phone and my friends and everything else are going to be distractions from that. And they're going to make me feel all kinds of things. But what I do is I have my bento right next to me. I'm looking at it right now, and I can look at that and can ground myself in, what did I say mattered when I was in a moment of rest and planning and consideration, and I've learned that I can trust that voice. And what I've learned through doing that is like a great day is a day where I do something for each box of the bento. where I talk to a friend, where I do a work thing, where I am able to like continue some discipline that's a part of a larger project. And that those are things that really contribute to me, I don't know, feeling resonant. And I can say for certainty that like 3 years into making every decision using this tool, like my outcomes in decision making are far better than they used to be. The strength of my relationships is far better than it used to be. And it's really come through practice and discipline. And so, it's like a self inquiry. But if you make it a ritual, it's just, you listen to it. Like I remember when I was CEO of Kickstarter, I once had this thought where I was like, if every morning I got an email, it's from God. Here's an email from God. Here's the 3 things you need to do today to be a great CEO. And like number 4 is like, don't tell anyone you got this email. Like that's always the 4th thing. Like I would probably do those 3 things every single day and just hope. Like, is this working out for me? And so, I feel like in this way, I'm in a dialogue with myself, and I'm able to learn and to focus on what's important. And so I do weekly bentos. I also made a bento for the whole year of what I wanted to do for this year. Each quarter I revise it. And these are just basically spaces of self-inquiry where I'm using a consistent lens, a consistent set of variables. And it's just been very practical and very helpful. So yeah, it's just those kinds of processes. And then, when you hit a real decision point, you pull out your bento that actually has your values and you make a choice from there. And I also do the same thing for the company. Like I have a bento I made for Meta Label to lay out what is our now me, what is our future me, what is our now us, what is our future us, what is our compass for decision making. And these are things that I will revise, but that, I'm just trying to allow my deeper thinking brain to speak rather than just my emotions.
That's really, really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there are many people who will appreciate the depth of the insights and the practicality of that experiential understanding of just some kind of structure, practice, discipline, and ritual, which is so much of what we're talking about this week. I want to push that a little bit further into like wider collective experience again, which is that one of the means that we speak about sort of coherence and harmony, as I said, the definition of value in the kernel syllabus is sort of shared truth, right? And there is something really interesting in the work that you've been doing recently around measurement and value and the mission economy, which brings us back to Mariana Mazzucato. And there's something that she picked up there, which is so resonant with your own work, which is she's sort of talking about how mission economies are those that induce cohesion rather than impose vision. And she has this really wonderful kind of slogan of, like pick the willing, not the winners. Pick the willing. And I really that speaks to me in such an interesting manner. I mean, one example of this kind of thing, which I thought was instructive, was in speaking with some of the data experts that you had on your YouTube channel just a week or 2 ago. One of the men, Ubaid, spoke about how in working with Muslim populations on the ground and taking the UN SDGs to them, he found a way to read the SDGs into the Quran and the Hadith and say, look, these SDGs are here already, and we can actually teach the UN how to do it properly. And it's such an interesting means of using stories to like get people to participate, to make them willing rather than in this win-lose frame of mind. And so like, I wonder, can you expand a little bit more on those kinds of stories which help us, find cohesion and therefore create value in a willing way, which is not about winners and losers, not about these finite games.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that, what you want to get to is allowing people to see that generosity is in their self-interest, right? Like there's an example I give in the book of what happens when we translate values, feelings of like what's just and unjust, into value, into numerical expressions. And it's like quite uncomfortable when this happens, but there's interesting things that occur. And a fascinating example is Adele, pop star Adele, who when she goes on tour, tickets immediately sell out. Fans end up paying hundreds or thousands of dollars more on secondary ticketing websites to see her play. And so like 6 or 7 years ago, she was doing a tour, and rather than have those tickets get resold, she found a startup that had built an algorithm that would measure how loyal fans were to her as an artist, and gave her the ability to algorithmically identify, using social data, like the top 30 percentile Adele fans in every market. And they used that to invite those people to buy tickets, putting no restrictions on whether tickets could be resold. And what they found was less than 2% of those tickets got resold versus like 50% in an open market. And in this case, this is only possible because this notion of like loyalty and fairness is being algorithmically translated and is being turned into a consistent decision-making point that she can make in a variety of scenarios. And so I think something like that is an example of where things are moving and a way that goods are being distributed in different kinds of ways. And that, you know, gives an artist or gives anyone the ability to identify a value set beyond their own economic outcome that they might want to optimize for, to maximize for. Now, these things are going to be clumsy. They're going to go into weird directions. There's going to be issues with them. But I think this attempt to express values as value, I think is quite fascinating and will increasingly be where a lot of this activity is going to happen. And that's where I'm very into the moment when Web3 decides to expand its its core metrics. I mean, we're very price heavy at the moment. So what are other sorts of qualities that we might use to highlight other things in Web3? Like, that's the potential. Is, in the past, the cost of counting was so high that you only counted things that you needed for survival or for wealth. But in a digital world, counting is nothing, right? The ability for us to distinguish distinct values is trivial. And so there's so much potential there for changing what are the rubrics we use to distribute goods, to make decisions. And that, that is a space that it's going to get really awkward and uncomfortable. Climate change is probably what's going to force our hand for it to happen on a mass level. But I think that is like a direction where we'll start to see the practical realities of our value systems change.
It's really incredible. We're going to move into some Q&A. I have literally an endless list of questions still left for you. I want to just highlight this beautiful seeming contradiction that delves us so deep into this beautiful reflection, which is that generosity can be in your own self-interest. There is, in fact, seen as I began this question with a point about the hadith, there is a hadith about this, Tanzil Sadaqa Rizq. Forgive my Arabic, but it means pull down your own provision by giving. That, like, in all of the great kind of wisdom traditions, you will find this notion that, like, it's by entering the stream of generosity, which is life itself, that you can that you will find more generosity in your life, because precisely it shifts one from thinking about value singular to values, and you find all of these other fields beyond right and wrong where pretty flowers blossom.
It makes me remember a financial reporter interviewing me about the book, and we talked about Adele. He's like, "You write about this Adele thing." He's like, "Why don't?" He's like, if she's giving her most loyal fans a cheap ticket, well, of course, like, she wins out on that. She's like creating loyalty. Like, she's not giving anything up. Like, this is absolutely in her self-interest. And this person was trying to do, like, I gotcha. See your whole. And I was like, exactly. It is absolutely in her self-interest to not maximize her economic incentives right now. It is absolutely in her self-interest to, maximize long-term loyalty. That is the idea. Like, she wins in that case. It's not that expanding our parameters of self, like, it reveals what's true, but yeah, so doing things for other people helps you, and pointing that out, like, it might make it seem like less generous somehow. It's like more self-interested, but it's true, and seeing that as being to our benefit is important, because There are a lot of people who are pro-social in the world, but there are a lot of people who aren't. And we should have systems and ways of being that work for everybody, and not just like people who want to do good. And so I think that, yeah, it does work out better to be generous. Like, we should celebrate that, If you want to win, you should help people.
Perfect. Yancey, thank you so much. Andy and Alicia, thank you for all the wonderful questions. We have at least 5 or 6 things to pick from to start us off. Yancey, maybe if you want to take a deep breath, we could probably maybe do 20-ish minutes of discussion. Does that sound good?
Great.
Okay. Perhaps Sister Tebebo, if you wouldn't mind, I think that there's a really interesting comment describing the bento box that you made. That could be an interesting place to start.
Greetings of love and light and peace and darkness. Thank you so much for the presentation tonight. It's really interesting. There's this power of 4 that keeps coming, the squads and the quadratics and the bentos. So like in my world, we would call it balancing the divine masculine and divine feminine energies within one body. So the divine masculine is, if you want to say, our I am this, I am that, I am how you describe yourself, your mental abilities, your ability to see things from an eternal perspective, from the air, from the ether. And the divine feminine is much more in our embodied state, the world of the emotions, the world of creativity, the world of intuition, the world of receptiveness. And so I see within the bento system, as you're looking at the 4 different options, really, as I say, from a spiritual perspective, 2 of them fall within the divine masculine, 2 of them fall within the divine feminine. And I see it as a theme that comes more and more through the whole of Kernel, is that so much of our lives now is based in the ether, is based in the internet, but we tend to spend so much time in that realm that then we forget to come into our bodies. And my question is usually, we all need to be hugged, we all need to be touched, we all need to, have good food and have movement and go outside under the sun and, be in the rain and in the wind and commune with the elements. And so it's to keep that balance. And so I think your way of explaining it resonates more with the audience, but I just wanted to parallel it with how we would speak of it in our realm.
Yeah, I love it. That resonates very much. And I really appreciate that lens. It makes me jump to a broad generalization, a very broad generalization, and then probably an overall unfair one. But having taught this to thousands of people in workshops, I repeatedly have found a common male reaction to the bento is to say, holy shit, I can't believe there's like all this stuff other than now me. Like it's quite shocking that there are these other spaces to think about. Where I find that when women interact with this, the most common response I hear is, oh, I'm already thinking about all this stuff. This is quite helpful for just organizing this. Thanks. Like I'll use this. But I do think that they're culturally based on where we come from, gender, all kinds of norms. I think we enter this in different ways, right? And we have areas that are more natural for us, areas that are more of a reach for us, areas that are more growth for us. But I think that when we can hold them all and still be true to ourselves is like, I don't know, that's the thing. You're in a good spot. Good things will happen.
Great. Oh, go ahead, Alicia.
Oh, I was just going to say, Michelle with a question, if you want to unmute Michelle and ask Yancey your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Yancey, for joining us today. It was super interesting to hear about all of the work around bentoism and whatnot. Yeah, my question was more along the lines of how you define us. I think Sid actually had a really great extension of this. A lot of Web3 involves a lot of online communities and congregations of people that you both know and are strangers. And this idea of collectivity, I think, extends beyond, I feel like maybe prior to Web3, I think of us as like my friends, my family, you know, the people that I still treasure and value deeply in my life. But yeah, so very curious to hear your take on the conception of us, both in the framework of Bento, framework of life, framework of Web3 and collectivity. And then Sid, if you want to add anything to that, I would also love to make space for that.
Well, I think that's super astute and definitely feels true of like, you know, to go with the Web 2, Web 3 analogy. I mean, Web 2, I think within organizations, there are high walls around the organization, you know, and you either work full time or you don't, you're a customer or you're not. And just there are very clear lines, and definitely not the case now. You know, the fractionalization of how people contribute to projects, the notion of, I mean, I see it repeatedly. If you come in with competitive type of language, people swat you down. Like, what the fuck, dude? Why are you, that's not what this is about. You know, so there's a clear, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, you know, in many ways, these cryptocurrencies are built on, in some ways, collective fictions that we're all believing in. And as a result of us all believing in them, they are manifesting themselves. And that continued belief is so important. And, you know, the meme language of Web3 is really reinforcing that. So I think that, yeah, I think that the usness is really changing. It's really changing. Now, there's a challenge to how it's changing, which is the book that's in progress is about this question. And, you know, we are like, there are a lot of people who are globally empathic and locally apathetic and unconnected. You know, we can be sitting in a room on our phones and like isolated from everyone around us. And we can be really connected to other people in a way that has no real cost or impact on our lives. And so like, does that sense of us, if it's just to like other avatars in the network, what does the world look like? You know, what does it look like when you go outside in a world like that? You know, I think that is not as clear. And so I think there is a danger in this usness of, do we lose, and is there a risk of diminishing our close ties? Is there a risk of de-emphasizing those things for this broader us? And my guess is that we will swing that way and probably swing back again. But that is maybe the one challenge I think that can happen.
Mm-hmm. Really interested to hear about that, because it does ring true. And I wonder how you find good digital physical overlaps as one means of exploring that. I have a sense this might relate to Ben Percival, your question a bit, even though maybe that's just my own mind. Ben, would you mind unmuting and we can continue from there?
Hello. It's Ben Percival with my question. I also want to extend my thanks and gratitude because, you know, my name's Ben and it feels like a backronym to do Bentoism. So thank you for showing Ben into the name. Love to get that name recognition out, however. Anyways, beyond that, my question just is a very simple one, but why is there not a past column? There's a now one, there's a future one, and just like thinking through the smoking example, if you do like past me, I'd love to, like, I enjoyed smoking. Present me wants to keep on doing it. Future me probably would be really happy if I stopped. So maybe it's 2 out of 6, it's like 33% as opposed to 25%. So it's like a little bit more of like nuance or something, but it just feels like I understand the simplicity of a 2x2 matrix so much, like alluring, beautiful, but also like by not having past data, like what are we, like that's the most salient, or like gives the most noise, or it gives the most signal, at least I would think. So like, what is the exclusion of past column in the Bento square?
And if I could add one thing, Yancey, if you ever start a bento DAO, Ben should be in it for many reasons. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
But
I actually am in Toronto as well, so I am bento. So just trying to throw that recognition.
I'd like to add what maybe was my own mind here when I thought about the past and Yancey, what you previously mentioned, which was the idea of ancestry and the idea of having a good sense of where we come from, not only looking forward to say, what would future me think about, this at my deathbed, but also what would my ancestors think?
Yeah. Great. Now I'm suing you now for your new Zoom username, by the way. So check your email. It's a great point. It's a great point. I think in the core bento, I'm thinking of the past as being like, now is standing at the peak of the past almost. Like the past is built into our sense of now. I think maybe on like just like a type 1 thinking, I think that's like a fair way to think about it. But there are versions of the bento that do have the past, and that came up through the community where, it came up during George Floyd, and we're like, how would you have any kind of reckoning? How do you reckon with something? How do you think about this? And it became about, well, we have to understand the past, have any conversation about the present. The conversation is just about now, and the future is like woefully incomplete. And so I think there are many contexts in which the past is like very material. And I've written a book, the Bento Method book, and there's a whole chapter on like bento with past in areas where I think that's relevant. But yeah, my first instinct in making it was like, okay, past is just sort of built into all these, how you're thinking about things now. But there are definitely places where that isn't sufficient. And so absolutely, it can go there. And there are people in the community who have also there's also a 9-box bento people have made where it's past, now, future, and it's like me, us, and then like larger us, us, a family, and then holistic us. And that's another thing people have done, which also is revealing. But then your own agency as a person, you feel really diminished in a place like that. And what I like about the bento is it is empowering. And if you have that notion, if you can see all those boxes, then your ability to change the future greatly increases. And these things really connect. I have a whole thing on that. But yeah, it's a great point, and you're absolutely right. But I think it's contextual when it shows up, when it doesn't.
Cool. We'll pass the mic to Aaron, and then I have a couple questions that I can ask for a couple of people who don't have their mics right now.
Great. So nice to meet you, Yancey. I'm a huge fan of Kickstarter. And I remember asking Kevin Owaki maybe like 2 years ago at a different conference. I was like, so Gitcoin's like Kickstarter, how are you different? And this feels very meta to me right now. And I love the analogy you made around meta labels. It gives me language for some of the things that I'm working on in kernel, outside of kernel. But my question actually had to do with the interface, and you kind of answered it with your last response. When I first saw Bentoism, it came by way of Rhys Lindmark, who I guess is a co-organizer of Denver, and he was teaching a class on blockchain ethics at MIT. And at the time, I thought I was writing my next book on emerging tech, so AR, VR, AI, and blockchain, and I ended up dropping the project. So appreciate you talking about dropping things, but why the concept of 4? Because I also came across in Atomic Habits by James Clear, the idea of the Eisenhower matrix. So when you mentioned, well, bento can go as far as 9, why limit it to straight to 4? And I'm Filipino and Catholic, and we think in 3s, and that if you're Filipino Chinese, number 4 is like considered bad, is like, I don't know. So I was just wondering, like, why 4? Is it the constraints of an 8.5 by 11 paper? Like, I was wondering what was your process of that, because when Sister talked about dualities of gender, I was thinking, well, you're talking about a duality of like time and also like space. I don't know. Like, I was just curious to know, like, why stop at 4? Why wasn't Bentoism 6? Because a bento box is like, I don't know, it can be so many different dimensions. So where did you stop as like a designer of that for the interface of what's considered enough?
Yeah. Well, how about I have a little, I have a slides here where I could just show how I had the idea. So I've been thinking about self-interest for many months and for over a year. And I was like halfway through writing my book, and I gave myself an assignment one week that I was going to try to storyboard my book. I was going to try to draw all the chapters. And when I tried to draw this chapter around, like, it was a chapter about expansion of self, I thought, how do I draw self-interest? And so I just drew a hockey stick graph. You know, I thought, okay, this is how we think about self-interest today. Like, go get yours. Whatever you want is going up and to the right. Like, this is success. And when I drew that, I then like had this thought of, what if I extended the axes of both of these lines of the graph? Because, you know, time goes from now far into the future, and our self-interest also keeps going. You know, the more you have, the more responsibility you have. And so then I had this picture, and suddenly that hockey stick graph looks really small. And I'm like, what the hell is all of this out here? And so I drew just simple boxes. I chose 4 instead of 6 or 9, but I drew these lines, just like, how do I demarcate the space a little bit? When I did, I very quickly labeled the spaces. So there's now me, there is future me, now us, and future us. And that immediately felt like true. You know, I could just, as I drew that, I was like, I felt like I just dug something out of the sand in the desert or something, some relic. Like, here's some true thing here. And I thought, what is this? And I wrote a very basic description. This is beyond near-term orientation. This is a 2x2 for seeing beyond near-term orientation. And I looked at those letters, and it was an acronym that spelled bento. And I thought, shit, it's a bento box. And so the bento box has this idea of hara hachibu, the Japanese dieting philosophy. The goal of a meal is to be 80% full. That way you're still hungry for tomorrow. So the bento is the same idea, but for our decisions and our values, leaving space for other people, leaving space for tomorrow. And so it's just like this very simple, you know, just like childlike step-by-step of just drawing lines and sort of asking myself what they meant. And then through that, building out this larger interface. And, you know, now it's like, you know, an organization, Nike, can use a bento to make a decision about what product to launch. You know, I show how Apple can use their bento to decide to launch AirPods. But it really began with, like, there's this hockey stick notion we have of like what succeeding is. And then I don't know, just playing with that, these other spaces revealed themselves. And just in my gut, I just was like, oh, I think this is real. And at that very moment, I made a video. It's like on Vimeo, but I like made a video of the drawing and myself narrating it, like within the first, 20 minutes of thinking of it. And then I spent a couple of weeks just like dwelling on it and playing with it. And then I asked a friend in LA, where I was living at the time, who hosted salons, if I could come to her house and try sharing an idea in front of a bunch of strangers, because I wanted to know, could I say this idea without throwing up, and what would other people think? And in that first conversation, people asked questions that revealed things about this form that I couldn't see because of my own way, my own biases, how I see things. And it just said, there's truth here. And that continues to be how I relate to it. I'm just like the guy who dug it out of the sand. But it is true, will remain true. So yeah, it was just that very basic process of just drawing, and it just sort of popped out.
Perfect. It's perfect. Romeo leaves a good comment in the chat. We're in kernel block 4, the bento block.
Yeah, great.
Happy about that. I think we might be at our last question. So I just want to say thank you to Yancey, and for everyone else. We will hop into Gather after, just to hang out for anyone who wants to be there. I'll put the link in the chat. Thank you so much, Yancey. One final question. It's from Rich, and I'll ask it for him. It's about this conversation about you trying the universal us. So the question is, how did Yancey try the universal us? Why didn't it work for you? And another way to ask the question, he says, is how big is the circle in which he includes himself? And maybe just a related one, which maybe you can get to quickly, is for yourself, accountability wise, when you're looking at these 4 quadrants, is it on your desk? Is that enough to keep yourself accountable? Or are there other ways that you do so?
Yeah, how did I test the universality? I mean, I think it was that because I have my internal voice that says you're not real, you have to make things real. I immediately was trying to use it to make decisions. And my first instinct was universal us. And what I found was like trying to decide something based on so many unknowns, so many different kinds of people, I just didn't even kind of know where to begin. Like, do I really know what other people think or want? Like, am I just projecting? Like, it just didn't feel, I don't know. I didn't feel like I was really basing it on anything other than just like maybe some wishful thinking. And I think my gut was like, I don't think that's a reasonable thing to ask of people. I think that's a hard thing for human beings to do because we all have in-group, out-group dynamics. We all have our hate follows. We all have darkness and light inside of us. And I think to me, it's just, what would be a system that would allow us to do better, to not fail at the first test, that would give us a path towards improvement in our circumstance. And so to me, it just felt like I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know how to answer it. And I was so focused on, I think this should be like practically useful. I think this has that potential. So I think that was what pulled me in that direction. I forget the second part of the question, Vivek.
For yourself, do you keep the 4 quadrants on your desk? Accountability.
Oh, yeah. So for like first couple of years, it was the lock screen on my phone. The bento was, so I'd always like to look at that. Now I have notebooks. I have a bento notebook just for this year that has like my bentos every week. It's sitting right over here. I flip through it often. The biggest training is like, if you have 5 minutes between Zoom calls, rather than like going to Twitter to, mess with your self-esteem for the next 5 minutes, you look at your list, you're like, what did I say is important? And you're like, oh, I call my friend. And you really call your friend for 5 minutes. You're just like, hey, I'm just thinking about you. What's going on? You want to talk later? And just like that little touch makes you feel amazing. It like regrounds you. It's like, oh shit, I'm part of this network. We think that's what like Twitter and tools like that do for us, but they don't. They individualize us. They give us a lot of feelings. But to me, it's like I'm an animal. I'm a dumb animal trying to make its way in the world. I have to help myself as much as possible. I have all kinds of faults. I need tools. I need basic things, or else I'm gonna fail what I want for myself. So a piece of paper next to me that I can look at, that I've learned to trust, it helps. It helps. And the simplicity, I think, is what allows people and me to like keep going back to it, to where it's not a lot of mental effort to do this. It's just, it becomes instinctual at a certain point. But yeah, it all starts with my own fallibility as a human being and the ways I disappoint myself and others, and not wanting to do that, and finding this as being a means of changing those outcomes.
Yeah. It's really beautiful. It's really beautiful to hear how your son has made his way into one of the quadrants, or many of them. And and thank you for sharing all of your thoughts. It adds a lot of color to the 4 quadrants, and it's I think incredibly wonderful to hear that Meta Label and your energy in Web3 is coming and is already here. So grateful for your time, Yancey. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'm hiring. Come work with me. I'm hiring. All right. Thanks, everyone. So great to see you. So great to be here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For anyone who wants to hang after, I'm putting the link to Gather Town. Thank you so much. The second half of Kernel begins. See you soon.
Do you mind if I ask, what positions are you hiring?
I don't know if Yancey just popped off. Did it?
Oh,
Drop his email ID in the chat.
Yeah, he put his email.
okay. Wait, and what's it for? Is it for Bento Society? No, for Meta Label, right?
Probably for Meta Label.
Got it.
Aw.
Got it. Cool.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, guys. It was an amazing talk.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Amanat. Bento, my man. So funny. Yes, thanks everybody. I'll be in the gather for a bit if anyone wants to hang. Let me.
Peace. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Lonnie. Scott Moore, you still there? Is that the real Scott Moore?
Hello, I am. I'm actually just moving between a few places here at the moment. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Seagraves is here too. It's a good late crew. Got the Gitcoin swag on.
We're still out here recording at the 4-person mark. We're ready